We do have a form.
Thank you, Mr. Treasurer, and I know that the superintendent is on her way as well. We were just finishing up a meeting upstairs. She'll be here shortly. Let's move on then to consider our minutes from the June 12th meeting. They should be before you. Is there a motion that they be approved as presented?
So moved. Second.
Moved and seconded. Questions, comments, additions, deletions? Mr. Treasurer?
I do have a comment, if I may.
Yes, sir.
In the minutes, you might note, and I hope Mr. Ragland noted, it was these sets of minutes, correct? That you had made a comment at the meeting when we got down to the formation of the committee, the levy committee. You asked for something to be reflected in the minutes. Hearing no objection to that, I did my best to listen to the tape, paraphrase your comment, and reduce it to about a sentence. I have a new methodology for doing that in the future, but I think the chair at that time had said, thank you for your comments, so noted, and I took the liberty of including that. We typically don't include language like that, but we can talk about that from a parliamentary procedure later. Well, anyway, I did that. I want to make that note, make sure that it adequately reflected your comment. Okay, good. In that case, I am ready.
All right, and assuming there's no objection to that addition? All right, please do.
Ms. Johnson?
Yes.
Mr. Jordan?
Yes.
Mr. Ragland?
Yes.
And Mr. Brown?
Yes.
That motion carried.
Thank you very much. Let's hear our monthly financial reports. Mr. Treasurer?
Okay, thank you very much. We have two reports this afternoon, one for the final month of the FY19 year, fiscal 19 year. That would be for June. And then the second one that will follow immediately is for July, the first fiscal year in fiscal year 20. The June report is fairly succinct and quick, I believe. We ended the year up about $37 million in revenues, and we had expenditures exceed the plan by about $6 million. That drove our ending cash to about a plus $32 million over the original plan. Some highlights for the revenue side. And what I want to point out here on this chart, really two things. One, the first two lines, property tax and state aid, that account for 93% of our income in the year, we were within 1%, or about $9 million on plan. So we felt pretty good about that. And then the largest variance we had was in other local, and we discussed that pretty much ad nauseum every month, having to do with pilot payments, investment income, Medicaid reimbursement. And that was the rationale or the explanation behind that variance. And that pretty much summarizes the revenue side of things for the month. When we get over to expenditures, we watch salaries and wages and benefits. Typically in the report, I combine those two into a personnel line, but I break it out here because we were watching those variances, one independent of the other. The only thing I'll note there, other than the fact that it did end up about 3% under plan, or $15 million, the split in the plan and expenditures is about a 70-30 split between salaries and wages and benefits. The variance, though, split about 47-53. So there was more variance in benefits than there was in salaries and wages on a percent to total basis. And we talked about that a bit, and I blame Scott for overestimating benefits all during the year. No, we knew that the benefit estimate was too high. We made adjustments for that, and you'll see in our July report how that variance has now changed to be more balanced between the two categories. The other thing that I would point out is in the transfer out category, you can see your almost $31 million transfer out that you authorized, well, you didn't, that the board authorized in the latter part of the fiscal year, and that accounts for that large variance there. Without that transfer, had that not occurred, our expenditures would have been about $25 million under plan. So it threw us in the other direction, but we know exactly what that was for. Other than that, in terms of the June report, you'll have all your standard or typical graphs and charts that I include, and you'll see how these graphs demonstrate or highlight those variances. Our percentage breakdown for revenues for the year, we're 37% state funded, 53% from property taxes. That's pretty typical for the year. When we get into expenditures, graphs, we were pretty close to plan on most of these categories. You can see here on the far right-hand side where other uses jump out at us, as I just explained the transfer. The breakdown, 64% in personnel, 21% in charter. That's typically 66 and 22, but again, the $30 million transfer, which appears over in other uses on the blowout part of that chart, has distorted this picture for this fiscal year, but we know the reason for that. This is just our typical charts for the variances. Explanation of other revenues, 14.6 in pilots, 7.3 over plan for investment income. The second Medicaid reimbursement payment that we received, typically we get one, they're catching up, we got two this year. And then the $0.8 million was actually the second payment that we got in income tax sharing. Again, typically we get one, but because they do it in that May, June, July, August time frame, if they're early a month or late a month, it can flip fiscal years on me. So we just got one and it flipped fiscal years. On the expenditure side, as you can see, other uses jumps out at you in terms of the magnitude, both in terms of dollar amount and percentage. And that pretty much ends the report for June. I think the takeaway was that I believe we were very close on the revenue estimate. The expenditures came in under plan, and we like plan to do that. I don't know how to say that. We plan to come in under plan because we're conservative in those estimates. We want to make sure that we don't have any budgetary appropriation resolution surprises throughout the year. And we ended up the year on plus 32 million in cash. So I thought that was good.
Any questions on the June report? Carry on.
All right, the July report, the first report for the new fiscal year. And the first thing I'd like to talk with you briefly about is, quote unquote, the plan and how we came up with a monthly spending plan against which we'll measure the variances and have some indication of, I guess, how well we're doing financially. And this discussion is really in the back part of your financial report and the management discussion analysis back on pages 16 and 17, and I'll briefly review some of those items there. First of all, on the revenue side, our revenue estimates are based on the May 2019 five-year forecast. We've not made any adjustment in those numbers for over or under from the prior year because in the May forecast we did for instance, in terms of pilot payments and investment income, we made some upward adjustments in that already. So there was no need to go from the May forecast to today in this plan and make any adjustments in that way. We did, again, though, use prior year's history month to month to look at what we can expect to happen on the basic assumption that the revenue should flow similarly this year as it did last year. Some of the items that are what I kind of call bullet payments, for instance, the qualified school construction bond payment, I know is once, but if it occurs in a different month throughout the years, I have to pick a month, so I did go back manually and adjust that. The property tax allocation from the state typically comes in two large chunks, so I kind of picked a month, even though it might vary a month here, a month there. Those are the only kinds of adjustments that I made where I knew that it wasn't a ragged flow, that it was really just a bullet payment. So I made some of those changes. So that. The revenue was pretty simple. On the expenditure side, I did something a little bit different. And if you like it, it's I did it. If you don't like it, it's, again, we did it. But we spent some time looking at the history of actual expenditures versus revised budget for the year. And I use revised budget for the year because that includes the carry forward purchase orders. So I felt that was a better number to use than the original budget, and we'll see some data on that. We did do it at the revised budget as of July 24th. Why July 24th? Well, that's the day I went into the system and captured the data. I didn't capture the data on July 5th at the very beginning of the year, but it was, for lack of better terms, close enough. Not many adjustments had been made. But I did want to note that it was as of July 24th. I then adjusted for the prior year spending percentage, and that's discussed in your MD&A on line 16, and those changes ranged from 12.7% expended of revised budget in one particular category to 100% expended. On average, at the aggregate level, personnel was set at 98.78% of the revised budget, benefits at 96.35%, purchase services at 94.5%, supplies at 81.1%, capital outlay at about 69%, and other expenditures at just under 95%. So what we were factoring in is this expectation and anticipation that because the spending plan is more of a cash flow model, that we would behave relative to our revised budget this year as we had in the past. It's just a demarcation point in time for us to say, assuming this, let's see how we do relative to that. What it does help us to do is understand that, we can look at these variances to plan, and then when we know how the plan relates to the revised budget, the plan relates to the 5-year forecast, most importantly, that we'll know what impact it might have on our October forecast as we go along. I just want to note Mr. Miller's arrival. Thank you. So, on page 17 in the MD&A, and this is hard to read, but this is, and I'm going to blow up different sections of this, talk to you a little bit more about it. I compiled this chart this year, and we'll track it throughout the year for the purposes of looking at these several different documents or sources of information and how actual expenditures track to those documents so that we can better understand the potential impact of those variances. The sources of information here are the 5-year forecast for May, the original budget in our accounting system, the revised budget from our accounting system, both original and then a current revised number, and then the plan. So let's group these columns together and take a little closer look at it. We start literally at the beginning of fiscal year 2020. And this is at the single digit, what we call the single digit of object level, the what we're buying, salaries, fringes, purchase services, et cetera. And you can see there I've listed what the May 2019 forecast included in it for these line items. The original budget is then listed. I show you the carry forward purchase orders so you can see that we brought forward almost $10.5 million in purchase orders and what categories they fit in, and that gets us to the revised budget beginning of year. I borrowed the boy nomenclature from our chief of accountability, who talks about what is it, boy, moy, and oi, beginning of year, middle of year, and end of year. So this is revised budget boy for conversation, and then for the plan. So you can see here how they total out. You can also see the impact that advances have. Advances are a very interesting creature. We plan for them in the forecast because they are a cash item, but we're not required by law to budget for them because it's simply a kind of a balance sheet move to help fund on a cash flow basis other funds that are short on cash. We include it in our plan because our plan is a cash flow item, but the budget and the original budget and revised budget are budgetary documents, and we don't budget for it. So I just wanted to point that out. Then I show you the current values, And the difference between the original, the beginning of year revised budget and the current revised budget, you'll see that there are some changes in there. And there's some things that go on budgetarily that happen based as a result of what goes on with carryover purchase orders. So that's a little bit more inside baseball. It depends upon when you capture it to see it. But most notably, the only thing that we've done in appropriation change was how many thousand for the board? 24,000 increase in appropriation that we approved back in July. Okay. Yes.
I do apologize, Daddy duty, so I apologize. Thank you all for doing this.
We finished June and we're into July. Those are the current budgets, and those are the ones that I will update over time so you can see where we are relative to where we started. I then do a comparison to the forecast because really we're interested in what's going on today that is going to impact the forecast. Are we going to run similar to the forecast, over or under? How might that work? So I just compared these different sources to the May forecast. On an original budget, you can see that the original budget was about $6.4 million higher than what was in the forecast. And you might ask, well, what was going on? Well, there were some budgetary things that went on, including some additional personnel that weren't contemplated in the May forecast. Remember, this is all about timing. The May forecast is prepared back in February and March. And somewhere around March, we got a new superintendent, and she had some plans and some budgetary needs and whatnot, but I had to do the forecast. So you do the forecast, it's that point in time. We move forward, and now we can see some of the impact of changes in what Scott had to work with everyone on the budget to ensure that we're set budgetarily. So that's about $6.4 million. Now, revised budget, you go on, it's 16, almost 17 million. Well, remember, revised budget has over $10 million worth of carry forward purchase orders. The plan actually, because it's based upon the revised budget and our spending habits, in other words, it's been reduced, is almost 18 million less than the forecast based upon our spending habits. But I want to remind you that in fiscal 19, excluding transfers and advances, we ended up 27 million below. So this already plans on an under expenditure relative to not only our budgets but our forecast, because that's a conservative nature. So as we go forward and through the year, we should be pretty close to those numbers is what I'm planning. If we run above plan, that just means we won't be so far below the forecast. If we run behind plan, then we're adding more than this $18 million variance relative to the plan. And then the current revised budget and the budget at the beginning of the year are substantially the same, but that will change over time. And lastly, I take a look at the plan and the current revised budget over the revised budget at the beginning of the year. First of all, that plan document, there's $34.5 million under the current revised budget that's in the plan. That really represents that spend. But really for me, most importantly, is this relationship of the current revised budget to where we started on a revised budget, because what that represents is a reallocation of our dollars. So folks might decide to move dollars into capital outlay or move it from purchase services to supplies. And so as we then spend, some of the variances that we'll experience month to month are a result of that reallocation. So we can begin to parse out the pieces of the variances. It could be a difference in our spending pattern last year or the previous years versus this year. It could be a difference in how we've decided to allocate the dollars during the year versus the beginning of the year. Ultimately, it could be because we're behaving differently. We're buying something different than we did last year. We've changed our minds on that. Or we're actually spending what we're budgeting. And that spend percentage will change on it. So just all of this data is there for multiple looks at this information so that we can get a better feel for where are we on a variance basis and what impact that might have ultimately on the preparation of the October forecast and subsequently the May forecast. So getting into July, it's the first month of the year. To be honest with you, all of these variances don't necessarily mean a whole lot because it is just the first of the year. I think back in my days as an investment advisor, when we looked at economic data, the best comment that I ever heard was one data point a trend does not make. So we need to build on this, and I often remind folks that it's best to look at school finances probably more on a quarterly basis. But that being said, for this month so far, total revenues have come in about $1.7 million under plan this month, and total expenditures were about $8.8 million under plan. On the revenue side, the highlight here is, number one, we're in, at least for July, the advances on the second half. I have first half property taxes. It's first half in this year, but it's second half in the calendar year, so I'll have to fix that. It's the second half property tax collections, the bills that went out in the May-June timeframe that come due, and we get distribution beginning in July and should get settlement in August. The other thing to take away from this at this point, and I'll perhaps talk a little bit more about this when we get to the state aid portion, but the state aid calculation in our plan does not, I'm sorry, let me say, the state aid calculation on the state's website, the SFPR, School Finance Payment Report, does not include the new money that we're getting, which has been referred to and is called the K-12 Student Wellness and Success Funding Allocation. And so I put this plan all together, compared the numbers, and went, the SFPR looks short. And I got Eric, the legislative person, I said, where's my $11.8 million? And so we go through the legislation, and after I put the plan together and run all these reports, it said, they'll be distributed in 2 payments. I was expecting it to be run through the formula somehow or be an extra line of the formula, and they divide by 24 and give it to me in 24 pieces. No, I'm going to get it twice, October and February. So we have a choice here. Either we live with some variances that kind of work themselves out every 4 to 5 months, or I could actually go back and between now and the next meeting, just modify my plan and put 2 chunks in there, and it'll cause a spike in the revenue. Either way, we know the explanation of the variance, or I modify the plan. It's really up to what the committee would like me to do. So those are the 2 takeaways on the revenue side in terms of highlights for the month. Because when we get into the numbers, not terribly exciting. Property tax is about $2 million under plan. Again, that's because of advances, and we'll know more when we get the settlement in August. The state aid number is kind of interesting because I just told you that what they're funding me now doesn't include that additional money, but we're actually right on target. So if my plan included the $11.8 million, but the SFPR says it's not in there, and they've begun distributing it based upon 1/24th, and I distribute it based upon the history of it, what's up with that timing? And I don't have an explanation for that yet. I'm going to assume that maybe my plan spread is just off, but we'll watch what it does. But I do have for you on page 4 in your MD&A a breakdown of the May calculation and our June number 1 and number 2 payments and differences. And you'll see that between my May calculation and the June and July payments. The July payments are in total about in the $12 to $13 million under the forecast, which means they've left that $12 million out. That makes sense. So I'm reconciling, and I just don't know month to month why that didn't come in essentially about 1/24th of $12 million short. Why we're this close. So we'll see as the months go by. But as long as I see that SFPR out there at a lower dollar amount and adding about $12 million to it gets me to the five-year forecast number, then I know we've got the projection right. No excitement on other revenues. And here, other financing sources had to do strictly with a return of advances that were a little bit more than what we had anticipated. Note here, other revenues, that's where the pilots and the investment income and Medicaid and all of that. It's running under. Don't get excited. You know, I'm sure we'll recover from that. But all those months where that was running above plan last year, it just takes us a while, I think, to get there. On the expenditure side, we're running about 8.9 million under plan. The bulk of that's in personnel. And as I said, if you believe I did a breakdown of that on page 7 in your MD&A. You'll see how that's more evenly split between salaries and benefits and salaries and benefits. Salaries are running about 4.3 million under, and benefits about 2 million under plan to make up that 6.4 million. Keep in mind too that right now, with new positions, not just filling old and existing open positions, but some of the new positions being added, those folks' payroll don't really start till August or September. So I'm expecting this to get closer to plan as the months go by. You also are engaged in one way or another in contract negotiations. So any results of that is not reflected in this. That would all be reflected in the September, October timeframe. So again, one data point doesn't make a trend. Don't get too excited about that under plan number. I expect that to dissipate in the future. All other expenditure lines accounted for about 2.5 million under, and nothing terribly exciting there. Again, you have all your typical graphs and charts that you can look at your leisure. Our variance analysis, again, property taxes on the revenue side jump out. Most of the other variances are noteworthy, not so much because of dollar amount, but because of percentages. And again, we are early in the year, so don't get too excited about that. My table here, everything's a low variance except for these all other revenues, and those account for about 3.5% of our total revenue. So I feel pretty good so far, 1 month into it. Same picture on the expenditure side. Personnel clearly jumps out. The items on other are noteworthy simply on the variance side. So July is, a great month for getting large percentage variances, but dollar amounts are not significant. So all in all, I think we're off to a good start. And we've got, that one chart that I said I would bring that's new that we'll monitor and help track this. And all of this is designed to help us get a feel for impact on our forecast, both for October and May, and as we, head into what you folks recommended and the board will ultimately act on in terms of being prepared to present financial data to the levy committee. So I feel real good. That's July, and I'll answer any questions that you have on this first month of the fiscal year.
I have just one. When we talked earlier about strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats, where are the particular threats to our pilots piece as we're looking forward? Is there something that we're looking at that may impact that income moving forward?
Yeah, pilots were obviously, as you mentioned, a big item last year in terms of a large dollar amount. We were actually looking at that today because internal audit is here. It was not this Kevin, but it was the other Kevin that spent some time with Jenny and I on a opening, what do you call the beginning meeting? Entrance conference. We had an entrance conference for an accounts receivable and revenue audit, and Kevin Sanskowski has already identified several areas. He goes, ooh, you need to explain these variances, and one of them was pilots. And I looked at the data that he had compiled. It was very interesting. It kind of went low, low, high, low, low, high. And I went, well, guess what? Low, low, triennial update, low, low, reappraisal. And so last year, those cases were based upon reappraisals. We had a lot of things to file on. Property owners had a lot of reasons to file to challenge the county auditor's assessment of your true value and therefore your tax bill. I think the volume of those will drop off next year, so we might not see that kind of a large variance there. In addition, there's once again a bill pending, I think is the right way to put it, in the House of Representatives. And I testified against a previous version of this, as did many people, but I think Eric can give it more technical justice than I, because I look at it as simply as a threat to not only us, but all boards of education in terms of putting some rather onerous additional steps in the process for filing or cases at the Board of Revision to request an increase in commercial industrial property values. I think we all have to keep in mind, why does a Board of Education file at the Board of Revision to ask that a value of a particular commercial or industrial piece of property be increased? Because it's unfairly valued. And if it's unfairly valued, that means that that piece of property, that commercial industrial piece of property, is not paying their fair share of taxes. And our efforts to do that aren't necessarily solely driven by our desire to increase our revenue. First and foremost, we want that duplicate set and those tax duplicate, the tax rolls, that's what they call it, the tax. We want to make sure that every property is valued at their fair market value, which is what the county auditor is charged with doing. But we watch that. And there's a real timing issue here too, depending upon when that duplicate is set and the tax rates are set. Because when Board of Revision cases come up, it's after that is set, and therefore unwarranted decreases in valuation result in a drop in revenue. Prior to that, if you understand how property taxes are set in House Bill 920, if we all own property, the tax rate is set at the aggregate level for all of our property. But if the people over there on that half of the table, their property value goes up by 10%, and people over here, our value only goes up by 5%, well, in the aggregate, it'd be about 7.5%. So they set the tax rate, because we can't get new money because of inflation. They set the tax rate as if all of us went up 7.5. So we get our tax bill, our value went down by 5%, but our rate went down as if it, went up by 5%, as if it went up by 7.5, so they reduced the rate more than necessary. Well, we get a reduction on our tax bill. The folks over on that side of the table, their values went up 10%, but their rate only came down as if it went up 7.5. It didn't come down far enough. So Jordan and Talisa and Gary and Eric and John get to pay a larger bill. But at the aggregate level, I at the district get the same amount. So I can remember in a previous job, there would be folks that after the tax bills would go out based upon reappraisal or the update, there would be a group of people that would come and complain because I would say, we're not getting any more taxes. And they would say, but here's my tax bill, I paid more money. So of the group, that group or this group, which people do you think came to the board meeting? Well, Scott and Jenny and I stayed home because our bill went down. And we might not have understood why it went down. Probably thought it was a mistake, but we weren't going to raise our hand and call anybody and say, hey, my bill went down. I'm not so sure that's right. But everybody on that side of the table got an increased bill and went, wait a minute. And they come and they complain to us. But it's about the tax rate. So why do we file cases? We want to make sure that every property, commercial industrial, not residential, commercial industrial and non-owner occupied income generating residential is valued fairly so that the tax burden is spread fairly and that we don't get shortchanged because of unfair values. That's why we file those cases. This bill sets to put in motion some rather onerous procedures for the board in terms of steps that you have to take in order to file those cases. Insurmountable, no. Necessary, no. I'll tell you, of all the things, I'm sorry, I'm going on way too long, but this really bothers me because this process works. The commercial industrial folks have an attorney. We have an attorney. we reach agreements outside of cases that are agreeable to both parties in terms of the tax burden that is, and the value that is appropriate for that party. It is an agreed-to settlement, and it just works. I don't know why we're trying to, there's so many things that don't work. I don't know why we're trying to fix it. I'm done, I'm sorry, I don't like this legislation.
The bill to which you're referring is in this General Assembly, House Bill 75, it was House Bill 343 in the previous General Assembly. In short, it would require boards of education, you would have to, first of all, have a separate resolution for each each complaint you would file. So for every complaint, there would have to be a separate resolution. Notice would have to be given to the property owners via certified mail, which is not a cheap process either. And they would have to be postmarked within 14 days prior to the adoption of that resolution. If you're able to provide electronic notification to that property owner, you can do regular, ordinary U.S. mail. But again, we're sending mailers to each of these property contests, tax contests. It has to be voted on separately. You cannot add this as part of your consent agenda. So you've already now added time to the board meeting to handle these complaints, and I'm sure as we start providing more and more notice, you'll start getting more and more phone calls, and the board will also fill up with folks who will be wanting to come and have this conversation. What's good about our process now is it takes politics totally out of the process, and that's what I think a number of school districts have a process very similar to ours where we've kind of set these thresholds. I think the treasurer noted that we only file on non-owner occupied income generating properties. So we're not filing on the individual's homestead. That's a good policy. And our attorney files based on those guidelines, and we're not looking to see who it is. What you run the risk of doing, I certainly, I'm not saying it would happen here, but what you run the risk of doing is you then have folks who can come and try to persuade the board, for whatever the reason may be. They can come to the public hearing and try to persuade you, not me. They can do it privately and say, not me. You run, you've now injected an element of politics into the process, which is actually the opposite of one of the intents that the sponsor has said that they want for this particular piece of legislation. Additionally, if the notice is not, if the resolution is not adopted, and that resolution has to be adopted prior to the cutoff, which I believe is March 31st under existing law, Board of Revision has no jurisdiction, and in fact they'll proceed. They can't proceed with the complaint at that point in time. So you have individual votes. You can have one vote, but individual resolutions. You've got to have certain amounts of notice before you can even put it on the board agenda. It's going to increase costs in terms of certified mail, in terms of ordinary mail, in terms of probably the time the attorneys are going to have as they're trying to sort these out and identify them. It's going to make a more onerous process, and it's not going to really have any if again the goal is to make sure that the tax duplicate is correct, it actually runs contrary to that, and more than likely will result in that tax duplicate being incorrect, because inevitably some of these parcels are going to get missed.
And for the attorneys in the group, some of the cases are dismissed based upon procedural error. Is that the right term? And so to me, just a layperson, doing this for 40 years, more procedures increases the opportunity for procedural errors. And I don't think that falls on deaf ears from the proponents. They know it will be burdensome. And they know if you miss a date, if you do the resolution incorrectly, and they can invalidate that before you ever get to the Board of Revision, they win. Because there's no onus on the property owner, and I don't believe the onus is on them when they file to do the same.
It is not.
So they can file, but if we file, we've got to go through all these steps. So
Correct.
Yes.
It is the
Same
exact
sponsor.
same sponsor for this particular piece of legislation. There has been prior legislation that's actually more onerous because it actually prohibited school districts from filing any kind of property tax complaint. The only tax complaints that could be filed would be by the property owner themselves. And so that particular piece of legislation, fortunately, did not go anywhere. The treasurer testified against that bill as well.
that
was Senator-
testimony was fun.
That was Senator Coley's legislation. It has not come up here recently. and I will say knock on wood, because it almost made it through the appropriations bill a couple General Assemblies ago. This last one, House Bill 75, it was when it cleared the House in House Bill 166, the biennial appropriations bill. The Senate took it out, which, we lobbied on it. I know ASBO, a number of other districts and organizations really pushed to say we needed this removed from the bill. This is not the right venue. It did get taken out, but we have to keep in mind this bill has cleared the House Ways and Means Committee. It is simply waiting a vote from the full House, and then it's on to the Senate. It was within a breath of passing last General Assembly. It had cleared the Senate Ways and Means Committee. It looked different than what it does now. It gets closer each and every General Assembly. So at some point in time, something is going to stick, and we need to be cognizant of that.
So, Mr. Ragland, and then I'll make a quick statement.
Sure, I would love to have a briefing from you on this, Dr. Roush. If you would like to include some of your thoughts in that as well, I would accept those. Very important piece, if you could kind of summarize all of that, and maybe if you would send it to the committee, that might be helpful for some other folks around the table.
Instead, did you testify? Did you say that against this yet? Has that
I've
happened?
testified twice.
Yeah.
When they had testimony, you were unavailable at that particular day to testify on this version of the bill.
Yeah, I haven't
You
testified on
testified on
this version,
343.
on the older ones, yeah.
The sponsor was quick to go after you after your testimony as well on that bill, and you did us all very proud, and you held your ground. On Coley's bill, actually, after your testimony, there were no questions, and the bill didn't go anywhere after that. So, that was an excellent job on that one. But this bill continues to make its way through the General Assembly. We're hopeful that it does not clear the House, but we'll have to continue to wait and see. And if it does make its way to the Senate, we'll fight the fight there. But we need to just keep pressure up and reminding our members of our delegation that we do not want to see this bill come to the floor and get voted out.
Thank you, Dr. Roush. Just as a point of reference, I wanted that as a part of the discussion today so that we educate the committee. You guys are some unusual suspects. They expect him to show up to the State House and beat the table of the dais. They expect that. But what about a Jordan Miller? What about a Jeff Jordan? What about a Kate Johnson? They're not expecting you. And you are everyday, real, on the ground, advocates of public education who are a part of the business community in some way, shape, form, or fashion, and really can shape a different narrative to this that helps make sense, why this is hurting a community as opposed to helping it. So I wanted to make sure you guys knew about this as a threat to our pilot program that you can see has been very successful for us. But here we are. This is an opportunity in front of us that may take us 2 steps back. But please be aware of this so that as we keep continuing to brief everyone on it, you guys can stand as advocates against this issue. So please keep that in mind. We can move on to opportunity study.
That'd be great, because that's pretty much the big threat that right now that we face, who knows. So moving on to item 4, the opportunity study update. Just some background, as I believe you should all be aware, this project started about a year ago, but it had its impetus from numerous conversations with Finance Committee members, some recommendations that came out of audit reports, both internal and external. And the original idea was to prepare procedure manuals for the various positions and functions in my office. And as that conversation went on, beyond just the audit issues, it morphed into more of an opportunity study to look at not only documenting what we do, but look at how we do it and what those processes were like, to look for improvements, efficiencies, things like that, and then other opportunities to do functions or perform differently that maybe we haven't thought of. And so that's how we got to the concept of a opportunity study. And to do that, I engaged an outside firm. We went through an RFQ process, interviewed, evaluated, and selected Ray & Associates to perform this work. And they've been working on it ever since. I think we started last summer, maybe, in some preliminary conversations, and into the fall with meetings, and really kicked it off in, I think, January of this year. A lot of time and effort and work has gone into this, and they're here this afternoon to talk about their approach, talk about where we are, talk about some of the deliverables, and give you an idea that where we're headed. This is not a start here, stop here, here's your book, thanks a lot, see you later, and move on, and then we just stop. That's not it. All of this is designed to be a continuous process, an ongoing process, to take their recommendations, look at ones that, see how we can implement and make some changes and go through that process improvement. Now, to that end, at least in part, or perhaps largely in part, in my office, I put in the budget additional position or positions to help address some audit issues, but more notably to address process improvement. So we created the position of Director of Financial Process Improvement, and I went through an extensive search process. I got out of my chair and walked down the hall and talked to Jenny, because Jenny, even prior to all of this, has done, it's a pretty amazing job, and she is like special fund supervisor. It's much longer than that, but she has all the accounts receivable and all the area treasurers. And as you recall, we've had some issues with cash management in the district, just receiving cash, getting it to the bank, getting it, all of that. And so for the state's largest school district, we've gone from, receiving cash literally everywhere to having 2 online payment systems, local level and Infinite Campus. Our customers or patrons, parents, whomever, can now pay, our fees online. We even have options for the schools to do the dance or a concert and have online collections. So you can pay by credit card, you can pay by ACH. And as a result of some committee work, one of the principals said, well, why are we collecting cash in our buildings? And I said, well, that's my point exactly. Why are we collecting cash? And it was a principal's suggestion to have a centralized cash collection point. So we put an area treasurer over at central enrollment, so that schools, if you come up with cash to pay fees, you can say you need to go to central enrollment. And it worked. I'll be honest with you, I was kind of shocked about central cash collections. I didn't think we would want to, direct people to one central location. But it works. I mean, I don't know how many, the area treasurer there touches quite a few of the account receivable items of that nature. So she did all that work, and we didn't really say much about it. But I thought back on it, we went in a year from this massive amount of cash collection to online work, and we're not a small place. She accomplished that. She also saw a need in another area and asked if she could attend some Lean Six Sigma training. So she went through a program where she had a project, and the project had to do with a certain piece of work that we do here. I got to sit in one meeting that she had, and then also went to her final presentation at her class. And the meeting that she had here involved multiple, it was cross-departmental, and it was truly a pretty exciting thing to see that process work and to see how everyone was engaged. We all talk about being collaborative, and sometimes I think we overuse that word, and sometimes I think some people don't know what that word means. But when I was in that meeting, I saw true collaboration amongst folks that were from different departments. The vast majority, well, all but one, didn't report to me. So other than using that process to engage those folks in this improvement, we had no position power, so we couldn't coerce. So it was pretty cool. So my selection of Jenny was an easy one, and I mean, I'm real excited about it. And so she'll be working on implementation of some of the recommendations out of the opportunity study, as well as doing an exhaustive look at all of our outstanding audit issues as well. So that's how we got there. We're here. We're I don't know what percentage of the way we're done. Are we 90% of the way done? I don't know. You guys can give me a gauge for that. But I'll introduce Chad Welty, and then he'll introduce his team. he was the main person I dealt with for this engagement.
We can have just a quick second, we make that transition. Mr.
Yes,
Ragland?
Mr. Mahort, you mentioned that we had the ability now to collect through credit cards for
Yep.
concerts and events, arts-based. Is that also a part of our athletic events? Can we do that at athletic events as well?
It can be done in athletic events. That was actually the first group that we took local level to. And now, mind you, that was before we had the committee that worked together to come up with some of these other solutions. Because one of the hurdles was who pays the fee? Well, Stan solved that one by, okay, he's got it in his budget, we pay the fee. Then the question just became, what kind of a market is. Some areas are more prone to using that, whereas some may be more resistant. So I did have one athletic director last year ask if he could pilot it a little bit for his girls' basketball. I don't know that much came of it, but I don't know how much of a push it had behind it. So I'd like to revisit it again this year going into it. One of the things that we talked about that, again, didn't get a lot of traction, so to speak, was trying to put out something like, say, a family pass or a student pass where they could buy it online at one time and it gets them in, say, to all the home football games, or however you structure it. I mean, you can structure it any way you want. But again, the questions kind of came in with, people won't have access to computers, which I don't know that I agree with that one 100%, but we battled and got through a good chunk of the hurdles. Honestly, the largest proponent of who's been using the online, at least the local level side of things, is your drama department. We had, I think it was at Eastmore, they did The Color Purple.
Yes.
And then they did an encore 2 or 3 night performance, and it was entirely online. They didn't accept it, and they took credit cards at the door. We have the ability to take credit cards at the door now. So they have taken it and run with it. But part of that was when they found out about it, I can't think of the guy's name, Rob Shuri had me come, and I spoke to the entire drama department, as did the 2 ladies from local level, and they laid it all out. Because you can go on and they can give them a layout of, hey, this is what our auditorium looks like, just like you do on Ticketmaster. You go to the Schottenstein Center, you pick a seat. It's the same kind of setup. So when they saw that, they went, great, because now they don't have to do the paperwork because it's all a report that gets printed off straight from the website. So not only did it get the cash out of their hands, it got the reporting out of their hands, and it made it a whole lot easier. So as we've had more successes, more people have come on, and like I say, I do intend to try to approach the athletic side of things again, because it is available to them. It's just not something that they've taken advantage of at this point.
The key here is availability. I think the only thing we dictated was all the fees are running on Infinite Campus, right?
Correct. Academic fees are all through Infinite Campus, and those have to be paid either online through the parent portal or at central enrollment. The difference between the Infinite Campus piece and the local level is Infinite Campus is where the centralized collection piece came in. That took the money out of the secretary's hands for things like my music fee or my senior dues fee. Whereas the local level tended to be more ticket-oriented. It doesn't have to be. Like, for instance, we're in the process of getting 2 of our latchkey schools set up to be able to take online payments through the latchkey schools with the intent of potentially rolling it out all across the board. But we wanted to pilot it they wanted to pilot it early with, we're piloting it with Berwick and with Winterset starting this school year. So I actually just forwarded the link of the website where parents will go so that they can look through it, make sure everything looks the way it is, or way it should be, and we should be up and running with that. So we have the ability to do it across the board. The difference with local level is if they want to pay in the building, or collect payments in the building, cash or checks, they do have that ability. So that, to me, is why local level would probably be the more likely fit for an athletic ticketed event, because it makes more sense. We have had some athletic departments put their fees for their uniforms on Infinite Campus, because again, you can assign, it gets assigned to a student. Infinite Campus's benefit is the fact that it can be assigned individually to a student.
Absolutely.
At the building level, whereas local level can reach out into the community. It doesn't have to be just students or parents. So it, depending on the situation and the opportunity that's there, depends on which direction we kind of push them. But
Any questions why
No, I see.
selected?
Congratulations.
thank you.
Welcome, Jenny.
I think
Welcome, yes,
it should be abundantly clear.
And I will say,
how disappointed I am that I'm not going to be working with her in the same capacity as before, because from the OHSA standpoint, we greatly enjoyed Jenny working with her on that capacity. So I can't tell you how happy I am that you picked her, because she is outstanding.
Well, here's the good news. Her old function is
still
still going to
oversee.
report to her.
You just made my day. All right, as we begin to move forward, because I know I would really want to get you into this opportunity study piece, I just really have to assert to the community, to the committee and watching community, that the board's priority, you mentioned process improvement, the board's priority has continuously been not just process improvement for the sake of your organization's efficiency and our adherence to our own internal audit recommendations, but also that we're looking at capacity building in this office. How are we building capacity in terms of knowledge capital? How are we building capacity in terms of functional resources that help us address issues like cash handling and reducing instances of that? So thank you for putting us on the right path. Welcome to the organization, this level of it, and we look forward to working with you. Stan, you want to introduce?
Chad, you're up. Great, thanks for having us here today. As with any opportunity study, I think even a slide deck has an opportunity to correct the spelling that you can see right off the bat that was pointed out while we're sitting here. I will point out, I'm not sure if this is on here or not, that this is Stan's slide deck, and if the spell check doesn't work, it's not my fault. I'm an accountant and not an educator or an English teacher, so obviously, I'm sorry?
I said, you want afterward?
But great. Well, thanks for having us here today. We brought some of the key folks along on our team, and I want to introduce myself as Chad Waldy, like Stan mentioned. Been with the firm about 15 years. I've been serving governmental clients for over 20 years. I've always enjoyed working with governmental entities. I'm really excited to be part of this team and this kind of project. It's something that you really don't see out there in the government environment. Trying to be more efficient and get more bang for their buck. Usually it's totally just focused on what's the cheapest route, and no matter what kind of service or product or whatever we get, we kind of just live with it. Let's see how well it works here. Also brought along Chris Liebtag. He's our Lean Six Sigma black belt. So you're going to be hearing a lot about Lean Six Sigma. He was part of our team here. Chris has since left the firm, but he's out on his own, doing his own thing. But we've kept him on the team until this project's done. So he's in it for the long haul, and he's actually lives in the community. So his kids go to Columbus City schools, I believe. So he has a vested interest in this project as well. Also a partner of mine, Chad Gorfito, has been with the firm 10 years. He's come in here and he's been a star. We have not let him leave, and we don't plan to. So we made him partner, and now he's vested himself. So he's been serving governmental entities his whole career, and he was a key component of this project. Not with us today. The RFQ requested some LED participation, and you may recognize the name Jesse Hemfield. Actually saw him today. I was over at a conference that I won't talk about because I don't think you're friends of the charter school conference maybe. But we did, I spoke over there today on a couple GASBs, but they're doing well, and Lisa was there as well. Your team also had some other CPAs and some certified information system auditors, along with an admin person to help. Apparently not enough check the spell check on some things. We will jump back and forth here. We all bring a different kind of specialty. We kind of put the slide deck together in terms of how the RFQ flew, the flow of the RFQ. So in order to speak on some of those items, it did chop it up here a little bit. But when we initially met, we thought our approach was going to be multiple fold, but we knew we had to get the team buy-in. I mean, the tone of the top starts with the group here in this room. Stan, Mike, all the department heads. We wanted to meet with them folks, get them to buy in, tell them that we're coming in to basically help them do better, listen to what their ideas were, not to come in like a quote-unquote auditor. Hey, this is what you're doing wrong. You need to fix this. You know, pointing out areas where we identified where some folks might have been doing some things great, And it could have been best for the whole team to do some of the same things. So that was the approach that we took. And then we went out and just met with them individually. And always just try to keep that communication going with them that, hey, we're on your team, we're part of your team, and, you know, we're not here to make it more efficient to where maybe half you people are going to lose your jobs. I think there might have been some of that sense of, hey, you get way too efficient, maybe my job's going to be in danger, and then they wouldn't want to cooperate and be part of the process. The scope of the RFQ covered these major areas under the Treasurer's Office. Section C3 of it laid out the detail of the scope that covered within those sections, and that's what we'll be driving through or diving here through today. So a lot of the process and everything was focused over these key objectives. A lot of these objectives are, you know, lean driven and compliance driven. Be more efficient, be more cost effective, improve the processes while staying in compliance with any kind of local policies that you may have and any kind of state and federal policies. We rolled these objectives out, shot them over to Stan, went through with them, him and Mike, the controller, and I think he rolled them out, and then they subsequently rolled them out to the department heads to take a look to see if any kind of tweaking needed to be done or anything like that. And this is where we stand right now with the final stage. I'm going to let Chad jump in here a little bit and talk a little bit about some of the heavy lifting on the procedure manual side.
All right, so jumping into our approach with the procedure manuals. So we met with over 50 people within the Treasurer's Department covering each of the separate departments and processes within the Treasurer's Office that Chad laid out on the previous slide. The first step in developing those procedure manuals was to gain an understanding of the step-by-step process for each individual employee, each process, and obtain screenshots for each one of those steps. Our mindset really was, if a brand new person came in tomorrow into that role with no previous knowledge of that process, they could use that procedure manual to complete that process. So as you can imagine, it was a very labor-intensive project for both the employees that were involved and for us. After we documented that step-by-step approach from the initial meeting, we drafted a draft procedure manual. We shared that with those employees, and we gave them an opportunity to identify any corrections, anything we missed, anything that needed changed. We modified those manuals, and then we actually scheduled a live sit-down with each one of those employees. So we sat down with the employee with the updated procedure manual, and we flipped through that manual as they went through the process, again, to make sure we captured 100% of that process. After the live sit-downs, we made the necessary updates if there were any, and then we submitted those procedure manuals to the treasurer, controller, department head then for their input and review of those. Also included in the procedure manual process was a 2-day live training with Munis. So we had Munis representatives actually do an online training with members of our team using a test version of the Munis system that matched the Columbus school system. So we were on the same version, in the same modules, and we walked through each one of the modules, mainly focused on payroll, AP, and cash management. And that allowed us to identify various functionalities within the system that maybe we could incorporate within this opportunity study, different functionalities, efficiencies, different ways that Munis trains individuals on how to use that system. We also gained access to the Tyler University system within Munis. That is their online training platform. So that included a lot of webinars, tip sections, things like that to make sure that everyone was using Munis to its full capabilities. And again, identify those opportunities to use the accounting system to its full functionality. Here you can see a sample of a step that's within the procedure manual. So at the top are the actual wording of the step, and then there's a screenshot. So for each step in the process, we have the wording of the step and a screenshot, and then we've identified different actions through the use of arrows or the red circles there. The red circles represent data input, the arrows are different clicks. So each step within the process has one of these screenshots So again, with the goal that somebody could walk in and complete that process with no previous knowledge. The next part of the scope was to review policies for ambiguities. We reviewed all of the finance-related policies within the board policy manual, read through those to see if there were any identified recommendations, anything that need cleared up. This really stemmed from an internal audit recommendation. So we also met with the internal audit team to get their views on which policies they felt needed cleared up and what the concerns were. And those items were addressed by management, and those policies were updated. The next part of the scope was to develop metrics and benchmarks. So really, the key here with the metrics and benchmarks is obviously performance indicators to review the performance of each one of those departments, each one of those processes, and monitor it over time. We identified over 30 metrics in total. We utilized common metrics within the marketplace using the ActPoint KPI study. It was a recent study that Columbus Schools was involved in and included in. So we went through that study to identify metrics that we felt would be the most appropriate to the school district, that lined up with the goals and objectives for each department that we identified on the previous slide. And then that would line up with the opportunity study and the opportunity recommendations so that you could monitor the improvement as you go along and implement those recommendations. We also developed some of our own internal metrics and tailored those again to those goals and objectives of each department. We included a couple samples of some of the metrics. Number of days in AP, that's a metric that measures how long an invoice sits in AP until it's fully processed and paid. Obviously, the less days in AP, the more efficient that process. You're ensuring invoices are paid timely, and you're taking advantage of any possible discounts that may be provided on those invoices. The number of manual checks issued outside of the normal payroll process, so anytime a manual check is issued outside of a normal pay run, that indicates there was possibly a breakdown in the process somewhere, whether it was a timekeeping issue, something with the rates that were entered into the system, or a step increase in the timing of those. There was a reason that a manual check had to be issued outside of the normal pay run. So monitoring and tracking those helps to ensure efficiency, because obviously anytime there's a manual check, it's inefficient and there's a cost associated with that. So that's just a couple samples of the metrics and benchmarks that were identified. I'm going to turn it over to Chris now to talk about the lean portion of the project.
Thank you, Chad. Good afternoon, everyone. So as you can tell, there are two distinct components to our work. The first being that building the manuals, the recognition of the existing process. There was a lot of work that needed to go into then how we were going to approach the opportunity side of this study. And so what we didn't want to do is be as nearly as time intensive as we were with the first half. Obviously, if we're taking professional time, utilizing it to build a manual, it would be not practical to take as much time to put everybody into a room and say, okay, now how do we improve? So what we were able to do was, through some fortunate circumstance, leverage a civil service questionnaire that the Treasurer's Office had participated in, along with a very brief questionnaire that we had ourselves created that focused on just really time and effort as it pertains to that individual's responsibilities. The questionnaire on the civil service end was more roles and responsibilities. So we were able to blend those two together to get a more robust understanding of what each individual responsibilities were and how they perceived their role in the organization. We were then able to utilize those narratives, those interviews that we conducted, to create what you see there in bullet point number 4, these current state value stream maps, because so much of the work that's done in the Treasurer's Office is virtual, right? We're knowledge workers, tapping on keyboards, thinking things through. We had to make the process visual. And in making the process visual, we could then see where the opportunities were for improvement, where the work slowed down, where people had to wait, the multiple loops of back and forth with information. And that let us, at both the department level and at that specific employee level, have these types of very specific conversations to focus our work. So fortunately, we were able to do a lot of heavy lifting without coming into the Treasurer's Office and taking their time. Although I will say then, the objective became to meet with every single individual inside the treasurer's office, which I had the pleasure to do, and to review these process maps and the narratives that we had assembled to make certain that they were the representation of the current process. Once we got that, or we tweaked that a little bit, we were able to then go right into the 3 or 4 crucial areas inside each and every process that had opportunity, or that was a challenge for that individual. And again, we did that on both the department and the employee level, so we created maybe somewhere in terms of 200 to 300 different value stream maps, flow charts, if you will, that we then reviewed with each individual. So the work was then segmented up into departments, and our approach was similar but needed to be tailored a little bit differently per department. For grants, as an example, grants is an extraordinary individual party of one in their department, so you can't get any more lean than that department. So what we did was focus our time and attention on his time. What was it about the process, the reporting he needed to perform that was taking a majority of his time? And unfortunately, through the 3 or 4 processes that we examined, we did hone in on a couple of quick, easy things that we could fix right away that would help improve that situation, such as some of the material that was being fed into the grants department process wasn't in a format that was user-friendly, and that was taking about a couple hours worth of work to get that information out. Well, fortunately, through some investigation, we were able to change the way that report was delivered and manipulated, and as a result took that from hours to minutes. Now, that's not a huge result in terms of overall organizational improvement, but for the one individual running a grants department, a couple hours a month is significant. And we were able to look at some of the back and forth and how we communicated internally and make some improvement recommendations there. And what you'll see in terms of the work that we did with every department, we eventually came to a conclusion that some of the opportunities inside our processes could only be positively influenced and impacted if we brought in the initiative and brought in other departments that had influence on that process. So at that point, in terms of our work, we had to simply stop, but then certainly point in that direction and make our recommendation to say, this needs to be an inter or multi-departmental exercise. If we're going to make strong headway in improving this particular process, it's not only going to be grants, but it's going to need to involve purchasing and budget and all of those various operational departments that have an influence there. So that's in every department, in every departmental investigation that we performed, that was the result of 1 or 2 recommendations was to broaden the scope. So we more or less set a foundation for that for Jenny and for the organization to continue with in future years. Moving on to accounts payable, and we'll go through this very high level. There's multiple recommendations for each department. We had a different tact and approach because we could. The AP department had more individuals, so more than a handful of people that we could meet with. And that's important because the Lean Six Sigma discipline espouses a team-based problem-solving method where you're able to leverage the different viewpoints of each particular team member, or member in this case of the accounts payable department, to look at the issues and to make recommendations and to talk amongst ourselves, being brain power of 6 or 7 greater than 1, and come up with solutions. And what we were able to do with the AP department was some immediate solutions, get things where they need to be for them, as well as take a look at where they were spending their time and thoroughly question the process. Is that the highest and best use of their time as a professional in the accounts payable department? And there were 1 or 2 situations where, in fact, they were doing a lot of work, but it wasn't adding value to the organization and certainly not value to accounts payable. So we were able to isolate that work and remove it out of their daily activities to where it was appropriate, and that gave them more time to focus on account payable activities. And there's a few additional recommendations that we made for technology and some revision. Now, the important thing here with this department, as with many others, we spoke a lot about internal customers. So how do we add value to the organization, and how do we look at each other interdepartmentally as internal customers? And this is where we had an opportunity to utilize an outside resource of internal audit. Because if we're going to make a change or recommend any change to a process, it's going to have a ripple effect, and it's going to influence other processes in other departments. And certainly from an internal audit perspective, if we change processes and procedures, they're going to have to encounter that later on. So this gave us an opportunity, at least with accounts payable and in certain other situations, to reach out to them as a resource and say, this is what we're considering. How would you treat this potential change? Or what would be good from your perspective that we could do so that it allows you to perform your function successfully and doesn't create issues later on? So I'm very impressed with the team that they were able to see that and offer that up as a suggestion and then pursue those resources as they came available to them. Payroll, I don't want to give you the impression just because this slide is short that payroll was not complex or complete. In fact, it demanded the most time and attention. It is by far the most robust payroll I've ever encountered in my professional career. We could not perform a team-based initiative with payroll because the complexity of city schools' payroll is such that every payroll clerk must be specialized in the payrolls that they perform, so that when they encounter issues, they know how to resolve those issues quickly and what to look for. So we had to meet with each payroll clerk individually, but all the same, they did a remarkable job validating their processes and then coming up with potential solutions such that you see that we have over 15 recommendations that cut across that particular department. Some were very, very short and easy. For example, one gentleman didn't have access to information and he spent a lot of time chasing that information down, and it was just as simple as adding him to an email distribution list. So I'm sorry that I couldn't represent that it's rocket science all the time, but fortunately we were able to combine a couple of quick, easy solutions with some recommendations that are longer term for payroll. You'll see more of those in the finalized report. Area treasurers is another department naturally we worked with, and that was a really fun department to work with. We got to split them up into 3 groups and tackle a variety of different issues and challenges that they faced, and their group, more than any other, was able to implement solutions almost immediately. And that was through the help and guidance of Jenny Vanover, to be sure. Whether it was changes to ticket logs, pay-in forms, fundraisers, budgeting reports, conversations about how we eliminate as much cash as possible and make things a virtual payment platform. We were able to implement a number of things right off the bat, but then also tee up some recommendations for later. What you'll see in the overall report is approximately 80 to 85% of the recommendations are from the team itself. They did not come from us as outside consultants. These were the Treasurer's Office personnel saying this is what we believe we can or should do. There is sprinkled in there, though, some outside consulting perspective, and one of those on the recommendations you see a slightly contentious one reads, remove area treasurers from the schools. Well, that's not entirely practical. However, what we noticed is that some of the area treasurers were getting pulled into different work that was outside the scope of their function, and it was creating lags and delays in their own workload that they needed to perform. And so some of the most successful area treasurers have a little bit of distance between them and the particular office. And so we felt strongly that if they spent more time training staff, specifically some of the secretaries, on how to handle some of the functions that they were assuming, that it would be more productive for the organization as a whole. Again, some of these things are more teed up as recommendations to potentially be implemented or to vet through on an implementation basis. They may not be enacted. It of course, how much is practical. Also with fundraising, there's an opportunity we felt from an organizational standpoint to leverage the district to negotiate some of the contracts or some of the fundraising activities with particular vendors, more so than school by school. Quickly then, just in the fixed assets department, and then 2 or 3 more slides will be done. Likewise, their department is a party of 2, maybe 1.5 when you consider all of the responsibilities they have. So we focused our time and attention on the on-site inventories, what they had to do to properly account for the fact that items were tagged or coded correctly at each individual school. And there were some significant opportunities on how they orchestrate the inventory audits and how they can interact with the schools to make sure that those schools are better prepared for them when they come out to do that inventory audit, as well as how can each of the outside departments that report into fixed assets be more consistent in their presentation of information and their timing of reporting. What I wanted to do real briefly is to show you some examples of that process map that I spoke of. This is just one sample. It's not a district map. It was a sample map that we had created. But you see the interplay, the use of symbols to stand for certain or represent certain activities in a process. And you see how things diverge, come back together. There's multiple steps. In the lower right-hand side, you see this little circle of death that I've created where people spend a lot of time looking for things that are maybe perhaps immaterial. In this particular example, it's two staff looking for a difference of $1.72 that they cannot find, that they took a couple hours of their effort to go and find. These things are real. Well, perhaps I will in the next one. Now, this one is just purely for effect. So if we take that same strategy and we're able to use this map conversationally, we take a look at one of the staff inside your AP process and we say, wow, you do a lot, and they certainly do. But this is not meant for me to go through step by step with you. It's meant more to tell you and to provide a picture of we're able to use this mapping strategy to bring all of the steps and activities that our professionals do into conversation so that we can highlight the select few and determine which ones we need to eliminate or perhaps combine to provide more efficiency and more effectiveness in their job responsibilities. And so then the future maps that we would create wouldn't have as many steps. They'd be a little bit more streamlined, but they were very effective in the way we were able to orchestrate this conversation and save the district significant time compiling this information. This will be a legacy for the Treasurer's Office to then carry forward with them and then revise these maps as they implement some of the recommendations. So thank you for your time. I'm going to turn this back over to Chad to carry through the rest of the presentation, unless there were questions you wanted to lob at me.
Well, just one very quickly. It seems like you've done a wonderful job in helping identifying where there's some silo effect taking place and how to create some consolidation that creates efficiency, that opens the door for that. How effective, and maybe this is something you'll cover, how much did we grow in efficiency? You had the ability to do the research and test its reliability at the same time. How much more efficient did we become as a result of what's your recommendation, or how more efficient will we become as a result?
So most of the efficiency is going to be measured individually on a time basis. Obviously, efficiency being a common metric of time. And so many of these professionals were able to shave literal hours off of these individual processes, or if you had rounded up, minutes off of a work day, et cetera. So when you're looking individually, it doesn't necessarily look like much, but it adds up departmentally, organizationally, into significant amount of hours. And I believe the next slide, Chad, that you were going to show is going to talk a little bit about the metrics that we developed for the organization and some of the recommendations. It's important to put hard numbers to that. With any organization, you need to keep score and make certain that we're progressing along the lines of our recommendations. So we'll talk a little bit more about that, but then certainly more to come in terms of how the organization is going to plot the success of this initiative, as well as the continuous improvement initiative it's going to carry forward. Thank you for that question.
From the combined work of Chris and the team in terms of, the opportunity, the efficiency, and just some overall recommendations to ensure compliance and so forth, to date, we're sitting at about 69 recommendations that we're going to be rolling out through the various departments. That number could sound high in terms of, oh my God, we're just not getting it done. Some of them are maybe more beneficial than others, but we did not want to make that judgment in terms of, that's going to be a great one for you that you're going to want. This one, they may not care about. But we think all of them are going to provide some opportunity for you folks, and we didn't want to pull out anything without, I guess the decision from you guys in terms of what to implement. In terms of some of the examples, Chris went through a lot of them. I'm not really going to dig into these any further. But there were just some of the examples, and those not necessarily count up to 69. Some of them may roll into one in terms of some of the efficiencies with bringing in some of the barcoding and the scanning opportunities with the invoicing, kind of like bringing technology into fold here to help speed up some of the processes, catch some of those errors that could happen on the front end. Just multiple different things. Accountability and timekeeping, I think that's been a lot of the problems maybe out there with some of the retro, not necessarily the retro pays, but the pay corrections, the outside the normal payroll cycles, or slowing down payroll process in general is trying to get those approvals done in a more timely manner and holding those folks more accountable. One other piece that was part of the opportunity study was to come in and look at the IT equipment. We had our CISA get involved, met with your IT department, go through, took your inventory and basically rolled out a deliverable, laying out what the scope of and I'm going to struggle through this part, the IT guy, I'm not. Your system requirements that you're going to need for your current Munis, future Munis, kind of like the replacement schedule that is recommended out there for normal IT equipment. We sat down, met with the controller, met with Stan, met with the IT department head, rolled that out, and I think we had some good feedback on that deliverable, and that was done early on. Also within the scope was responding or advising on the internal audit and external audit recommendations. Up above are the internal audit reports that we have received to date, so if there has been any issued since then, we have not been provided those, and we have not addressed any of those items. What we will be doing is rolling out a deliverable that goes one by one through the internal audit reports issued, identify what items are outside of our scope of the engagement, any items that have been since corrected, and ones that we believe will be addressed through any kind of other work and deliverables that we've done. We did take time to sit down with internal audit, ask them some questions on some of the items that maybe we didn't quite understand just based on reading the report, so we made sure we had clarity in terms of any of those recommendations that they had. We also did receive the fiscal year 18 reported items from the external audit and looked at the responses that were going to be prepared towards that, give some advice whether we thought the response was adequate enough, or maybe give some suggestions, and even identified any areas that the opportunity study deliverables would be addressing in terms of their comments. Final deliverables to date that we expect to be rolling out. The procedural manuals. We expect to present one printed copy. I think that's all that's really asked for. We expect it to be well over 1,000 pages long. The format of it will probably be section by section within one manual, and then the folks that need certain sections can take out and copy what they want. We also are going to provide it in a Word format. It's going to be a living, breathing document as Munis makes updates, or if things get tweaked with any of the recommendations, that someone can get in there and make the appropriate changes as necessary and continue to keep that thing moving forward. The opportunity reports within each section that covers a lot of those recommendations made. We're also going to have a general overall section recommendation. Through the process, we had some opportunities to maybe provide some recommendations that didn't fall within those items that we learned over the process. So we're going to roll that into just its own one little report. The IT assessment report that we mentioned has been delivered. Probably separate the benchmarking and metrics, the workflow maps, and then the responses to the internal auditors will be separated. Some of these things have happened already. We could throw that all into one big massive report, but probably separate, and it'll probably be a little bit easier. The final decision hadn't been made yet, and we'll work through that. So where do we go next? We were asked to tell you where we are, status. Many of these items have been presented for review in terms of, hey, is this exactly what you expected? Are we meeting your expectations? Getting some final feedback in terms of cleaning those things up. And once we receive that, we'll be rolling out a lot of those final deliverables. We've pretty much met, I think, on everything to date that you've seen on that screen, one way or the other, whether it's been in electronic form or paper form. And then we'll be out of your guys' hair. No, we won't. It's good to hear. Good to hear. So I appreciate you guys' time. I don't know if you guys have any questions for us at this time. I'm not sure if we gave you enough information, too much, but I wanted to make sure that left the floor open for an opportunity as well.
Mr. Treasurer.
Just my closing comment, and a lot of this has to do with deliverables, things you can see and feel and touch and talk about. For me, really it's great to meet the audit responses. It's great to have the document. That's all fine and dandy. But for me, what I think long-term in a sustaining outcome of this is the conversations we had with staff within my office as we began the project, and to set the expectation of process improvement, and to do it in such a way that it was non-threatening, and to develop for them the norm that they should be looking at this as well, and be welcoming them as we come back on a continuing basis to have this conversation, and not have to have that big step up to get everybody on board. We've achieved that, and we've set the stage, if you will, for this future conversation, an ongoing conversation. And that, to me, is worth the effort. The documents will change over time. The processes will change over time. But what's important is that we have the people here that are willing to embrace that activity. And while that really wasn't specified in the RFQ as a deliverable, I think it was a significant outcome of that to see. Really, I've been working with accounting staff folks for a long time, and to go in and to begin to have a conversation, you know, they want to get my job done, right? And to have them raise their head up and look around and see how they interact with others and see what they're doing and be open and honest about, you know, this isn't working right. And then also have a venue, as was mentioned, quite a few recommendations came from the staff who was doing the work. And to provide that climate where they're comfortable in making those statements and recommendations, and the next step, I think, is to have them reach fruition. How many projects have you been involved in? You sat down with people, you worked with things, and at the end, they hand you a document. Here's the results of our report, and you go, well, that's nice. And a year later, you look at it and you, well, we didn't do anything with this. So now the key is to do something with this, even more so than what we've done along the way. But I'm actually most, I don't know whether it's proud of or excited about what we did with the people and getting them set up and willing to embrace this kind of approach to their work. That just, I mean, it just sets the stage for better things to come. So that's something that, I guess that's an intangible, but I think it's really, really important. The other thing too is notice how many times they mention Munis. I mean, Munis is our RFP system. How many times we had to interact with them. How do you use your system? Tell us how to better use your system. And that is a hot topic now with the other side of the house as well, in terms of talking about how we use Munis. So it's the realization that we have to make an investment in getting better. Training, online seminars, whatever it is that's available. We have to get better because, you know, you don't want a situation where he says, I really don't like the way we're doing this, and then the Munis expert, whoever it is, comes in and says, well, that's on this page, or it's that button, or it's this feature to do that. And again, setting the stage for people to be willing to look at their work and do it a little bit differently is great for them, knowing that sometimes with your systems, you have to adapt what you've done to do it a little bit different but achieve the same outcome. That's a whole human interaction behavior kind of a process that is, it's often tough to come by. And we did it, I think, with my very large staff. We're not talking about 6 people, we're talking about 50. So that's exciting to me. I love all the output stuff. That's great too. I want to check the boxes. That's great too. But sustainable, we've got something going on, you know, with that, and we've achieved it. So.
Any other questions? So as you talk about this continued engagement, obviously there's going to be some continued work to make sure that we embed some of these things. I mean, what do you see in terms of timeline for that? How long do we have to have the training wheels? And I don't mean that in a negative way at all.
Well, one of Jenny's big tasks is to begin to tabulate, if you will, what's come out of this report, where are we with audit reports, where are we with all these suggestions and recommendations and findings and citations, and then begin to organize that into a work plan. That's going to take several months to do, just to get to a point of saying, here's what we have, here's how we're going to, I want to prioritize all of these things in our mind as to where we are, knowing full well that we can't be all things to all people, and we're not going to get to all of them tomorrow, but we have to develop a work plan. So we're several months away from that. We're backfilling some positions here to get those people up and running. So I would expect in the, by December, certainly to have a work plan of some sort figured out. But again, we're gonna start to piece and parcel that out and have that ongoing relationship so that we can touch base on an as-needed basis. Since they know our work so well, they know what the recommendations were and get a feel for how to proactively approach executing those that we want to move on.
Thank you.
And I actually have broached this whole concept. Again, today I met with about an entrance conference, and when we got to the part about management responses, I just said, we want to be more thoughtful about our management responses. So that may require time to do that, but it's not to drag our feet. It's to look at what's been found, determine the magnitude and priority of that, and then fit it into the overall work plan and make it a response that is well thought out and is able to be delivered on in those items. And so all in all, that I would think we're going to spend the balance of this calendar year just organizing ourselves and assessing where we are relative to some other issues and develop that work plan so that we can move forward. Knowing full well that some of them, we've been doing them on the fly.
Thank you. Are there any other additional questions, comments, thoughts? Awesome.
Good, I'm ready.
Is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Is there a second? Second. All right. Motion's been moved and seconded, Mr. Treasurer.
Okay. We have Ms. Johnson?
Yes.
Mr. Jordan?
Yes.
Mr. Miller? Mr. Ragland? Oops, he stepped away. I didn't know when he left the meeting. I'm sorry. Mr. Brown and Mr. Cole?
Yes.
A motion carried.
Thank you all. Thank you so much.